medium of paper mache. It's a relatively simple one that's fairly accessible with simple tools and simple materials and a flexibility to the recipe as well as the things that you make with it. You can be as free form with it as you want or as rigid and precise. So what I'm doing here is I am going to build a three-dimensional letter, a letter F for Fimbel Lab, a prop of sorts, I guess kind of like a keepsake. So what I'm doing here is I am laying out the letter F on this Cheerio box. I'm not being terribly precise or measuring much here. I'm mostly kind of eyeballing things and being a little bit freeform with it. So here you can see that I have a normal pair of scissors. This kind of cardboard cuts really easy with a normal pair of scissors. And at this point I am transferring my original layout over to the back side of the box. Here I do a little bit of measuring, but I actually use the scraps from the cutoff of the front side of the box to transfer measurements over to the back side. It's a fairly simple process. Whenever possible, I like to avoid measuring because it goes a little bit faster this way. But if I need to be precise, I would measure. This doesn't really call for that. But the scissors do a good job of cutting up this cardboard. Once I finish cutting out the shape, I sort of tape the box back together, taping the flaps down with painter's tape. What I'm going to do next here is kind of interesting. I'm using the scrap piece from the front side of the cut to cut pieces that go in between the flaps of the kind of sticks of the F. And by using the scrap piece, I already have a piece that is precisely folded so that the shape itself will be the correct thickness all the way around. This is another simple way of kind of saving time. I could fold other pieces of scrap to do the same purpose, but I already have a piece of scrap that I can use that's pre-made. So here I am cutting up the pieces and taping them in place to generate some structure. So one thing I've done here is giving some structure to the box, but still leaving some gaps to show that the paper mache can really fill gaps. So here I have a few different types of paper, some newspaper, some printer paper, some copy paper, and right now I think I have some newsprint. So newsprint is essentially the paper that newspaper gets printed on. It's also inexpensive drawing paper. This is my old sketch pad here. I don't know why I did it in this order, but I'm just kind of showing how the papers rip. So when you make paper mache, you want to rip up the paper and use it as smaller chunks of paper. The newsprint, one thing that people don't often recognize is that paper actually has a grain to it, similar to wood, like a wood grain. And right there I was ripping along the grain for the strips, and you'll see here with the newspaper I try to rip it against the grain and it doesn't work out that great, so now I'm ripping it with the grain. So I'm prepping up a few different kinds of paper. What I like to use for paper mache is the newsprint, but newspaper works well. Any paper really can work well for paper mache. So there's three different types here. You can really use anything. Now I am going to make some simple paste. There's a lot of different recipes for making paste for paper mache. One of the simplest ones is basically just flour and water in roughly a 50-50 mix. So I think here I made, so I have about a cup of water and about a cup of flour. I think pretty much any kind of flour will do. Right now I used kind of warm water and it's not mixing together very well. It's kind of really clumpy and lumpy. So I've decided to heat it up a little bit with a microwave. Not much, just 22 seconds. And that helps kind of break up the flour some and make it into a paste. We're looking for kind of a consistency that's a liquid but has some body to it. I'm adding some more water here. And one key ingredient you'll see in just a moment right here is that I'm adding some salt, regular table salt to this. So flour and water, if it's just the flour and water paste, it can kind of generate some mold as it dries, or if you are going to be working on this project for instance, multiple days, you can put this in the fridge and save the pastes. Right here you can see the consistency of the paste that I kind of like. Still have some lumps in there, but I kind of like a little bit of a soupier paste. Really, people kind of find their own consistency that they like and tailor their recipe for it. So I am showing that you can put this in the fridge and save it for later. This is actually my preferred method of making paste with flour. Essentially, I am going to warm up some water on the stove, and this method uses a lot more water. So it's about 5 parts water to 1 part flour, and pretty much just heat up the water and get the water to the point where it first starts boiling and mix up the flour into it. And what this does, so adding some salt there, again to prevent any kind of mold from happening. And it also kind of increases the shelf life. You can see this is after simmering for a little while how kind of gloppy this paste is. I really like the how smooth the consistency of that paste is. So here I have my prepared paper and my prepared paste and my prepared form. And pretty much just taking ripped pieces of paper and coating them with the paste. I bet many of you have probably done this. This is actually a fairly simple project that is often done with school-age children. And one thing that's really, I feel like the paper mache medium is often overlooked as a way of making some inexpensive, simple 3-dimensional forms. You can work really large with this stuff, and it's very user-friendly, really. So as you can see, I am displaying how you can use the paper mache to kind of fill gaps, and how I'm using the paper mache to bridge those big gaps there. And the paper itself gives, as it dries, it'll give some structure to this form. Right now I'm coating the whole piece in newspaper. Because I'm going to be painting this, it's nice to cover, so if I were to paint this form with just the newspaper, a lot of the print would kind of bleed through the painting, and I would have to paint it a number of times. So this first coat here is really just kind of a rough coat. It's advised that you try to keep the layers less than 4 layers thick, or else you might run into some issues with drying time, as far as the moisture not wanting to kind of leave the paper mache evenly. So I'm kind of crisscrossing the layers here so that it adds some structure. The grain of the paper will add some structure, and the paste, I'm essentially kind of making almost like a plywood, if you will, out of paper. And this is still the roughed draft here as I'm going in very high speed fast forward. Just covering every surface here so that it's going to be an even coating of the paper and paste. So this is an even coating of paper and paste. So that's the first coat, all done, kind of even layers all around. And then what I want to do is I want to put one last coating of just the newsprint. So this is, again, newspaper that doesn't have any printing on it. And what that does is that helps give a nice clean base for paint, essentially. So it's totally reasonable for somebody to make paper mache and leave it as newsprint or newspaper printing, just the regular newspaper showing. If that's what you want, that's totally fine. But what I'm after is a painted surface. So this is kind of almost like priming the piece, getting it ready for paint by giving it one last smooth coating of just kind of clear unprinted paper. I find that the newsprint is a little bit more flexible than the copy paper. The copy paper can be a little bit stiff. And right here, I'm going to let it dry fully for 24 hours. So now I'm going to dip into our crafts cabinet in the general workspace, and I'm going to grab some paint. So we stock that craft cabinet with all sorts of supplies that when you make it back to campus, you're welcome to come in and grab and work on your own projects. So I've put down some paper to work on here, and I am simply just going to paint this this F here. This is an acrylic paint, so it's a very friendly water-soluble paint that you have to be a little bit careful about how thick the paint is. If you have it a little bit too thick in some spots, it dries a little bit darker than in other spots. So I'm just going to try to give it a nice even coat. And you can see on those spots where the paper created kind of like a bridge, it wasn't exactly perfect as far as being fully square, but it definitely did the job. The paper mache portion of this project is effectively done, and right now I'm just giving it a nice blue paint job. So I let that dry fully, and now I flipped it over and I'm going to paint the other side of the F. So that is essentially a paper mache letter for Fimbel Lab. So many people know that I am a huge Zelda fan. I love The Legend of Zelda. I think they're the best video games ever. And I love the art of the designs of the props. And I've decided to make a paper mache shield, Link's hero shield here. And what I first need to do is make the form. What I'm doing here is I'm taking regular cardboard, corrugated board, and I'm sketching out one half of the shield. And I'm taking regular scissors here for cutting the corrugated. Now, corrugated cuts okay with regular scissors. It works a little bit better with an X-Acto knife or a utility knife, but I understand that some people aren't really comfortable with that, so I didn't want to limit it to just using a utility knife. I'm happy to show anyone how to safely use one when you return to campus. But I first want to show you that you can use regular scissors with corrugated. Here comes the utility knife. What I'm doing is just going to carefully cut along the lines as I build the form for this shield. Now, you can use pretty much any material for making a form for paper mache. Traditionally, I think a lot of people use things like, for instance, balloons. You can inflate a balloon and cover it with paper mache and then pop the balloon. That's one way that people make piñatas, for instance, a nice hollow form. But you can really use almost anything. Some people take rolled up pieces of paper and tape them together. You can use aluminum foil. You can kind of use any kind of form you want. You can put wood inside of it if you need structure, or wire. Really, it's a form that you then put the paper mache over, and really all it does is holds the paper together in a shape while the paper and paste are drying. So what I'm doing here is I'm cutting out the form for the shield. A shield itself is relatively flat, but I wanted to give some form to the shield. I wanted to kind of make it look a bit more three-dimensional. So right here, I'm using scissors as a tool for doing what's called scoring. So I'm scoring the cardboard there, essentially just kind of crushing it in a straight line, and it gives it a certain area of weakness for the fold to happen. So it's a controlled fold. If you ever have played around with cardboard, corrugated board, you've noticed that it can fold really easily along the corrugation lines, but it doesn't want to fold very easily against the corrugation lines. So scoring is a really, really simple but very effective technique of controlling how a fold happens. So as I said, that a shield is a relatively flat form, but I wanted to give this kind of a little bit of a pyramidal shape to it, off-center pyramidal shape. So by cutting out that skinny triangle, that skinny wedge, and then bringing the two angles there together, I've created some depth to the cardboard. And I'm just, again, taping this together. It doesn't need to be super strong. The more paper mache that you add, the stronger that the form will be. So what I'm doing here is I am laying out some additional form that I'm going to glue onto that shield piece. Trying to transfer my lines. I'm working a little bit rough here. Paper mache in general is kind of a bit of a rough medium to work with. You can be very careful with it and be very exact, or you can be kind of sloppy with it if you want. It depends on what kind of finished product you want out of it. This shield, I was a little bit sloppy with it, but you'll see that it comes out pretty nice. So here again, I'm using the utility knife to cut the cardboard. The blade in there is a very, very fresh, brand new blade. It's really important when you're using a utility knife to use a sharp blade. You have a lot more control with the blade when it is sharp. Oftentimes it's when the blade gets dull that people kind of force the knife, and that's when it can slip and you can cut yourself. So I'm using a very fresh blade, and I believe I even switched the blade halfway through this project. So here I am transferring the shape that I cut. I apologize, I didn't do the best job of framing some of these shots. This is my first YouTube style video, so please bear with some clunky filming, if you will. I'm just transferring my lines here so that I can cut out the forms, and you'll see what I do shortly about kind of building up the form. Much of this video here is sped up. There's no way that I would use a utility knife as fast as I have on some of these cuts. That would just be completely reckless. So this is definitely fast forwarded. Again, you can use scissors for cutting up the cardboard, but I find that I personally have a lot more experience with a utility knife and feel more comfortable with it. Use only what you're comfortable with. So I believe I cut out 4 of those longer pieces and 4 of the shorter pieces. I'm moving my work area over into the other part of the shop, and as you can see, I have a hot glue gun there warming up, and I am laying out the pieces that I want to glue up to build up the edge of that shield, kind of thicken the edge of the shield. on the sides. So the pieces that I cut out were not fully exact. So at some point here I have to kind of fill in a few gaps. But again, this is a little bit rough. You can be a little bit rough with the paper mache. And just like the 3D letter, you can fill in some of the gaps. So that hot glue gun is a little bit undersized for the bigger pieces there, but it's working okay. As you can see, there was a little bit of a gap in the center there. I'm not concerned with it. Right there, I'm actually filling a bigger gap in the bottom, but it's cardboard. You can cut off little slices, fill them in here and there, and use glue or tape or whatever you need to make up the form. So my main form is done there, and now I'm going to grab a few pieces of scrap and freehand some drawings of the center Triforce piece for the shield. That's the 3 triangles in the middle. Using a pair of scissors to cut the cardboard. If I had really wanted to, I could have been very careful about measuring how the shape of the triangles, but I'm keeping this a little bit kind of free form. I'm not too worried about accuracy on this. It's all, close enough. So right here, I'm putting that center triangle over the seam. You can see where it doesn't really, it kind of teeter-totters right on that seam. I'm going to use the back side of that knife to score the center of that cardboard and essentially just crush it so that it can bend a little bit and fit over the form of that seam a little bit better. Using more hot glue to glue down the cardboard layers to get my center Triforce piece there. And then what I'm doing here is I'm making kind of a double layer, because what I want to do is have a bit of that pyramidal form. And because I'm using the paper mache, as I lay the paper over those forms, it'll fill in the gap that's left by the step of those triangles. And you'll see how that comes out. What I'm doing here is I am laying out this kind of zigzag pattern that is from the shield. It's a little bit tricky because, like I said, I'm keeping this a little bit free form as far as not measuring things out. That was just a sketch on there. But I do want to make sure that I'm relatively consistent from the left side and the right side. So what I did was I traced that form, that paper, and cut it out, and then traced it to another piece of cardboard. And this is all just scrap from when I cut out the original forms. And I'm cutting that and scoring it so that one piece can fit there and then the other one can fit on the other side. Similar to the triangles, what I wanted to do was have the center portion of those zigzags have a bit of a straight edge in the middle. So I grabbed a piece of wooden dowel here, and I'm cutting little tiny chunks of wooden dowel, and I am going to glue them into the center of that zigzag form using some hot glue, and kind of carefully laying those over the center of the zigzag. And when I cover that with the paper mache, it'll kind of fill in the gap. It'll fill in the gap of the dowel and the cardboard, and it'll give it kind of more of like a mountain range kind of form to it. Okay, so here I'm actually using paper bags. This was recommended by Luke Yeager, who also works in the Fimbel lab. he said that he really likes using the paper bags. So one thing that I did kind of mess up here was that when I prepped my paper, I really should have cut it up, ripped it up into smaller pieces. You can see I have kind of some longer strips, and I should have thought ahead about what kind of forms I was trying to cover here. So I should have really ripped these up even smaller. One thing that is interesting about the paper mache, oh, yep, so do not glue on our cutting mats. That creates a bit of a mess. So I'm going to move that out of the way and put down some paper so that we can kind of stay a little bit clean. Here I'm going to mix up a third type of paste. This is Elmer's glue and water. It's a 50-50 mix. That seems to work really well with this. But basically just watering down glue. This Elmer's glue works well. One issue that I've had with the flour paste is that if you ever store your creations, the things that you're making out of paper mache, in, say, for instance, a basement or an attic, mice really like to eat the flour-soaked paper, whereas the Elmer's glue, they don't seem to go after as much. So there I am ripping the paper into smaller chunks because I have to fit the small pieces over my small forms. So I put a nice even coat of the glue and water mixture over this paper, and sometimes I even like to soak the paper in the glue, and that really makes it really malleable. So one thing about the paper mache form, the paper used for the paper mache, is that if you use a cut edge of the paper, it seems to leave a bit more of a seam in the paper, whereas if you use fully ripped up pieces of paper, as you can kind of imagine, when you rip a piece of paper, you're actually kind of ripping the fibers, and the edges of the paper are thinner right where the rip is, as opposed to kind of like a hard cut edge. So I recommend taking a little bit more time than I did to prep your paper, and paper is cheap, so if you end up ripping more than you need, it's not that big of a deal to recycle whatever is left over. But here I'm taking my time using smaller pieces to kind of fill those steps, the gaps of those steps in the pyramidal forms and the zigzag kind of mountain ranges there. As you can see on the spots that I've already kind of put down the paper, there's a lot of glue kind of left on the surface there. You can work really pretty wet with this, and right there I didn't even dip that piece at first. I used it as a sponge to kind of soak up the other glue. And this right here, I am working the paper into those seams of the built up layers of the cardboard, really covering the edge of the kind of open side of the cardboard. And I'm wrapping it around the sides and onto the back there. And now in the center here, I'm putting down more pieces, more out of a way of keeping a consistent form. So I technically didn't need to add paper mache to the kind of middle field there, but I wanted to give it the same texture feel as the rest of the piece. And right here, kind of rubbing my fingers, making sure that all the seams kind of lay flat into the corners there. It's really important now to let this air dry for at least 24 hours or maybe even more, depending on how many layers of paper and paste you put onto that piece. So now this is the piece fully dry. I believe it was possibly 2 days there. And what I'm doing here is I broke out some sandpaper, and if there were any kind of areas that kind of where the paper was maybe bunched up a little bit and it stuck up above the surface, I'm just kind of knocking off the edges there. And you can take your time with this. Sometimes you can, if you really want to make it kind of perfect, you can take your time sanding it and really get away from any of the seams. So right now what I'm doing is I'm priming this. I could have covered it with the newsprint to give myself a nice clean surface, but what I wanted, because I knew I was painting this with a few different colors, I decided to use this Kills primer. There's pretty much any primer would work for this, but this is just what I had on hand. So I'm going to give it one nice solid layer of primer and make sure that there's no real gaps. If there were, I could go in and fill them in, maybe with some more paper mache if need be. So back to the craft cabinet here, and grabbing some more of the blue paint and some brushes. One thing that I regret on this project is I should have been a little bit more careful at this step. I'm basically painting the back field of the blue shield, and I wish I had kind of been a little bit more careful about where the blue was. And that's primarily because when I do my next step of painting the Triforce, the center triangles, I realized that the craft paint, you can kind of see through it, so it needed a few more layers. So what I realized that I should do is carefully tape out where I wanted to have the different colors of paint. So this is blue painter's tape. It's something that you can purchase at the hardware store. Some people like to use masking tape. So you could either, for instance, be really careful about where you paint, or this is a great method of kind of, I'm a bit of a sloppy painter, so I make up for it with carefully taping instead of carefully painting. So essentially I'm taping off the edges. Anywhere the blue tape is where the blue paint is going to remain. So we're all taped off here, and I reach for the yellow paint for the Triforce. And that's when I realized that the blue paint was kind of seeping through. So what I ended up doing was just gave a really, really heavy coat of the yellow paint. Typically I don't like to lay on the paint as thick as I did there, but it worked. It worked well. So I think I let that dry overnight. And now I'm going to go back and kind of give a second coat of primer where I realized that the blue paint was a little bit strong on the edges there. So one thing about the blue painter's tape is you don't want to have it stay on the piece for too long. Sometimes the adhesive can actually stick to the paint below and peel it up. So you want to not keep it on there for too long, a day or two at most. So here I've mixed up some gray paint, and I am painting the outside of the shield here. I had mixed up that paint out of some black paint and some white paint that we have. And later on here I've mixed up a few different shades of gray to give myself some highlights. But that all it took was one decent coat of the gray paint around the edges and on those center pieces. The paint is all fully dry now, and now I'm going to carefully peel up the blue painter's tape and reveal the nice crisp paint lines. As I said, I'm a bit of a sloppy painter, so this is kind of the only real way that I end up with some straight paint lines. But you do what you can. You do what you need to make it work. So there we are with the shield fairly well fleshed out. And I'm going to shift gears here. Because we are the Maker Lab, we have all sorts of cool things like really nice software, Adobe Illustrator. I'm going to take the bird design here, and I am using Adobe Illustrator to generate some geometries so that we can use our laser cutter to cut out that bird shape. This right here, I'm flying right through this. This is not necessarily to teach how to do this, but just to kind of walk through every step of the Illustrator process to show how you can go from an image fairly quickly to the outline geometries. Here I am at a different computer and at our laser cutter. So we have two different laser cutters. The larger one is a 120 watt and the smaller sister is a 60 watt laser cutter. I've loaded up my file here and I am adjusting the settings. So I'm going to be cutting out some paper. These right here are our sample chips that give us the direction of the settings for the laser, for the different power for the laser, so that it will have enough power to cut all the way through the piece but not set it on fire. It's a fairly simple process. It's a little bit more intimidating than I was very intimidated at first, but it's actually a relatively simple process. There's a few simple rules that you have to follow. For instance, the laser needs to be focused at a very particular length off of the piece. And this little triangular thing here is our key, our tool that makes sure that we are focused on the piece. And then I've sent over the file. Right here I am turning on the compressed air. There's an exhaust system and compressed air that sucks the fumes out of the laser cutter. So this is actually the real time. The rest of this video has been very much in fast forward, but this, even though it looks like it is in fast forward, that's the actual speed of the laser. It cuts out remarkably fast. It's an amazing piece of equipment that each of you can use when you finally make it to campus. So there we are with the bird cut out. Again, I could have carefully painted that on this piece, but I'm not the sharpest painter, so this seems to be a nice option. So I'm just kind of carefully figuring out how I'm going to lay this piece on here and dealing with that ridge. But I basically just folded the piece of paper some, and I'm using hot glue to glue the red pieces down. So the next step here, I'm kind of adding some embellishments. I'm going over the lines of the paint lines there to kind of have them accentuate them, make them pop a little bit more. It kind of adds, this style adds a little bit to the cartoon quality of the shield. Something like this would be fantastic for cosplay, for instance. And by using this paint shading technique, I'm kind of going over some of the planes that would be highlighted in light and kind of accentuating some of the shadows of the piece. So this is the final shield. This is the finished bit here. You can see the lines that I had drawn on there. So the three-dimensionality of this piece is a little bit subtle, but you can see right there that it is indeed there. On other pieces, you could go really three-dimensional with paper mache. That's what it really excels at. You can see that it's not perfect. You can see some of the paper lines and some of the spots where I wasn't exact, but it worked out well. Thanks for watching.